Boker tov lechulam. Good morning. It's early, but we have a full day, so I think that rather than waste 5 minutes, we should begin right away. Now, before introducing our distinguished speaker, first of all, I'm Gabriel Motzkin, and I'm the director of Van Leer, and I'm going to ask you to do what I often forget to do, which is to turn off these machines, which is annoying but necessary. It's complicated on some machines, I know that. See if I know how to do this myself. Let's see where it is. Sounds. There we go, vibrate on. All right, now I would like to talk about this conference because I think it's a very important conference. And I think it's a very important conference, and it wasn't easy to set it up. And it wasn't easy to set it up for the following reason, that we ran into some people here even at the Institute who were opposed to the idea of a conference like this. And I think it behooves us to reflect on the reasons for a minute, because if this is true, the story that this conference is telling, then we are on the eve of a major change in Jewish life. And because we're on the eve, or we're already beginning a major change in Jewish life, it upsets our story of diaspora and Israel. In other words, in the story of diaspora and Israel, we're either Zionists, or we're anti-Zionists, or we're pro-diasporist, or we have nostalgia for those wonderful homes in Poland, or something like that. But in any way you look at it, that's the dialectics of our story. And suddenly here come possibly new Jews, depending on how you define them, but I think they will be sooner or later. And since I think there will be sooner or later new Jews, and they upset this story entirely. The paradigm of diaspora and Israel doesn't fit this story, and so it makes people here uncomfortable because it changes the way they think about the world. Now, I think that when we attend this conference and listen to the talks, we should have this idea at the back of our minds and be open to it and think about what are our own set ways and paradigms about thinking about Jewish history and Jewish fate, and how the effect of having 10, 14, I don't know how many million people from the third world largely join the Jewish people. This is what's really being talked about, whether you believe it or not. Join the Jewish people, how that affects our story. And what could that possibly mean? And what kind of story are they going to tell themselves? Is that the same story? We Jews are very good at adopting the identity of other Jews. Jews from Iraq bemoan the whole Holocaust and all kinds of things like that. And that's always been that we prefer collective memory to individual memory. But even then, the collective memory itself changes in relation to the communities that adopt it. Well, with that said, I'm not going to continue expatiating, and I would just like to, for a moment, introduce our speaker, who I think is the leading authority in this subject, who thought about it 30 years before the rest of us, and has written lots and lots of books, which I shall not even begin to list here for you, about this subject, and has been telling us for years that we should pay attention. And with that said, Tudor Parfitt is, of course, distinguished professor at Florida International University and emeritus professor at SOAS at the University of London, and we can go on and on. But I don't want to take up more of his time, and so I'm going to ask Professor Parfitt to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go to the...
Yes.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak. To start with, I should begin with what is always a slightly controversial point, and that is that no matter which way you look at it, there are various aspects of Judaism and Jewishness which essentially belong to the world of ideas and to ideologies, and therefore can be accessed by anyone in the world. Anybody who has the desire to access them can access them. and they do not belong, therefore, exclusively to Jews. And it is the case that for hundreds of years, non-Jews have been fascinated by Judaism, but because of the straitjacket of different kinds of religious tradition and the draconian punishments meted out by Christianity and Islam to those that demonstrated their fascination with Judaism, the numbers of converts remained very few. However, recent times have seen the total breakdown of social and religious barriers in many parts of the world, and this has had one effect, and that is of bringing Judaism to a wider and wider belief community. Powerful constructions of Judaism and Jewishness, which I shall try and describe, have by now developed into a global construct, manufactured in part by imaginary ethnography, which touches people in every corner of the globe, of every colour, of every faith, of every ideology, and with the advances in the technology of communication at a faster and faster rate. Throughout the world, there are vast numbers of people, very different from what we might call the Jewish mainstream, who now consider themselves in different degrees to belong to the Jewish world and who are ready, poised to join the Jewish people. Now, the topic of the workshop is new ways of joining the Jewish people. And I suppose what I'm trying to do in this paper is to present a kind of theoretical underpinning for understanding the processes which have led to the situation which we now collectively confront. What I will start with is by saying that the chief mechanism for the construction of so many would-be Jewish communities throughout the world is colonialism. And so essentially what I am doing is engaging with the work done over the last 30 or 40 years in the field of post-colonial studies. The mechanism of colonialism which creates Jews, or creates Jewish-seeming communities, has been going since 1492, approximately, when Christopher Columbus first arrives in the Americas, and it has persisted ever since. Recently, I was with the Rabbi Sussman sitting on the front row on the left here. I shall be referring to them throughout the paper from time to time, and we were together in Nicaragua. The initial point of the visit was to see some new converts, and I subsequently went there by myself. And on the second trip, I discovered that in Nicaragua, which one would think is probably as far away as you could possibly imagine from anything Jewish, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people in Nicaragua alone who consider themselves, for complex reasons, to belong to the Jewish people and to have Israelite origins. And this is true in many other parts of the world, from the Bnei Menashe, who will be discussed in this workshop by Galit Ashur, who's sitting at the back, also from Miami, to the Bnei Ephraim. Dr. Egorova, sitting on the front on the left here, will be discussing the Bnei Ephraim from India, and groups like the Bnei Israel and the Beta Israel, which are much better known to most of you here. In Africa, apart from the two main communities I'm going to discuss today, there are hundreds of thousands of Igbo and Tutsi, and the great scholar on the Judaization of the Igbo sitting on the second row at the back. Put your hand up, please, so everybody can see you. And he will be talking about the Igbo in due course. And we have a very, very promising student back in Miami who herself is a victim of the genocide in Rwanda, who is going to be doing the first serious work on the Jewish movements among the Tutsi. But apart from these, there are syncretistic churches in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, South Africa, and countless other groups and tribes throughout Africa who passionately believe in their Israelite or Jewish origins. And this isn't particularly recent. By now there's something of a longue durée as far as these associations and identities are concerned, both in Africa itself and also in the Americas, because black Jews or black people have been claiming Jewish identities ever since the end of the 18th century. In many cases, both in the USA and in Africa and elsewhere, the adoption of the colonial construct of Judaism was an attempt to acquire dignity. It was a way of deracializing the stigma of being black. It was a way of not being subservient. It was a way, perhaps, of not being a slave in the full sense of the word. It was also a way of reaching the heights of social and historical distinction, a way of plugging into the sacred history of their colonial masters as major and direct players. In Ghana, for instance, when the king of the Ashanti, Ose Egeman Prempeh II, was restored to the throne in 1935, after a longish lull, he wrote a book demonstrating the pure Israelite origins of his dynasty as a way of confirming the legitimacy of his line and the sacredness of the throne known as the Golden Stool. This is one of many examples of this phenomenon. In Africa, this process, the process of acquiring or claiming Jewish ancestry or Jewish belongingness, has had since the beginning a good deal to do with notions of race, with the weakening of biblical authority during the period of the Enlightenment, around the end of the 18th century. New racial theories started to develop which served colonial purposes extremely and vividly well. One such theory, which was a blend of 19th century racial theory and biblical exegesis, was called the Hermetic Hypothesis, which argued that people of a superior racial composition in the African continent were the descendants of Ham, and that they had conquered the Negro population at some remote point in history. The Hermetic Hypothesis was conventional academic wisdom from the first decades of the 19th century until around 1965, when I was in my second year at Oxford. So it had a long life, and it's relatively recent. The hypothesis conscripted biblical history and the history of ancient Egypt in such a way as to make Caucasians the legitimate heirs of these histories, neatly excluding Africans from this Eurocentric framework, while preparing the ground for the conferral of a ready-made history on certain other groups of favoured Africans, who were considered to be closer in looks and in behaviour to Europeans. Hamites now began to refer to a variety of lighter-skinned peoples who were thought to descend from the ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, Canaanites, Ethiopians, and particularly Israelites. A good deal of Western investigation of these so-called Hamitic tribes was associated with establishing sameness between them and Europeans. It was a way of proposing that these superior Africans had some kind of link with their colonial masters and also with the sacred history of their colonial masters, while Negroid Africans had no such links. One British journalist, Edmund Dean Morrell, wrote ecstatically of the remarkable knowledge one of these superior Hamitic tribes, the Fula, had of the Hebrew legends that they lived in their daily lives and of their wonderful racial characteristics, the straight-nosed, straight-haired, relatively thin-lipped, wiry, copper or bronze complexioned Fulani male, he writes, with his well-developed cranium and refined extremities, and the Fulani woman with her clear skin, her rounded breasts. These superior people were often dubbed Israelites, while perceived Jewish, physical and other characteristics were systematically attributed to them throughout the African continent. At the same time, their religious practices and beliefs were explained systematically as being the product of some ancient Israelite template. The creation or suggestion or imposition of identities, narratives and histories by colonists, missionaries and others was a modern reiteration of medieval works, including the 9th century Jewish writer Eldad Hadani and the fabulously successful Sir John Mandeville, which had insisted that in the unknown heart of Africa there were Jewish communities, Jewish kingdoms and the like. In time, these constructions, both medieval and colonial, were internalized and created a vast number of Judaizing or Israelite communities throughout Africa, many of them syncretistic. The number of tribes who, at some point or another, have been constructed in this way is simply staggering and includes the Igbo, we've already mentioned, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, Tutsi, Zulu, Kosa, Masai, Bassa, Ibibio, Fula, Banyankole, Baluba, Khoikhoi, Shona, Makalanga, Esan, Efik, and many, many, many others. In Nigeria alone, as Daniel Lees has shown, there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people who believe that they are descended from ancient Israelites. In addition, today there are emerging communities or Judaizing communities throughout Africa, from Uganda, with its quite well-known community, to Kenya, with large, new, emerging Jewish communities of different sorts, from Cameroon, recently visited once again by the Rabbi Sussman, and I presume they had difficulty getting through the border, as they've been so recently in the lands of Ebola. Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ghana, etc., most of whom, to one extent or another, owe their Jewish identity to colonial interventions of different sorts. Increasingly in Africa, and I think this is an important and quite interesting point, Christianity, or at least Western Christianity, is viewed as the religion of colonialism, imperialism. Islam is tainted by its associations with the slave trade, and more recently with different kinds of extremism, whereas Judaism is seen as a religion of freedom and peace. Including natural deaths, famine and war casualties, in all 8 million European Jews died during this period of the Second World War. According to our distinguished colleague, Professor Sergio Della Pergola, were it not for the Holocaust, there would be 32 million Jews worldwide today, instead of the current 13.5 million. The future loss, as he writes, compounded by the tender age of so many of the victims. The Zionist movement had anticipated that substantial numbers of these Jews would provide immigrants for their great project of building a Jewish state in Palestine. With their loss, the Zionist leadership first brought in survivors from the DP camps, and then Zionist agents trawled the Arab and Muslim world and flew in hundreds of thousands of dark-skinned Jews from around the Middle East. Once the full scale and horror of the Holocaust became known in about 1946, a group of influential and high-ranking Jews living in Palestine anticipated the demographic problem of a future Jewish state might face and made the decision that the Holocaust losses would need to be replenished. To bring this about, a number of bodies were set up, including one which was called Aguda Leman Nidre Israel, or Organization for the Lost Tribes of Israel, which my friend and colleague Professor Trevisan has written about. The chief players in the Aguda were Jack Feitlovich, a scholar of Ethiopian languages, and we owe the masterful biography of Feitlovich again to Professor Trevisan, who is here today, known as the father of the Falashas, or Beta Israel, Nachum Slush, the Hebrew scholar and intrepid traveller in North Africa, the Arabist Israel Ben Ze'ev, the ecumenically minded journalist Shalom Ben Chorin, and the pioneer Labour Zionist, scholar of some of the marginal groups of Judaism, and second president of the State of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. These and other individuals shared a utopian and quasi-messianic vision that went far beyond the normative Zionist goal of bringing Jews to their ancestral homeland. The Aguda decided that the time was ripe for Judaism to do what it had rarely done before, proselytize throughout the world. Shortly before his death, in 1955, Feitlovich was making plans to set off for Japan to set up a Jewish outreach center there. It was also, according to the Aguda, the time for the Jewish world to incorporate different tribes and groups, mainly in Africa but also elsewhere, who were looking for a way to rejoin or to join the Jewish people. It must not for a second be forgotten that in the imaginaire of the Western world, Jewish and Gentile, the idea that the unknown continent of Africa was peopled with Jews, which had prevailed, as I have already mentioned, for about 1,000 years, was still active. In the dark days after the war, after the Holocaust, as the extent and viciousness of this genocide were becoming more widely known, there were Jews who were very anxious to try to replenish the human reservoir of their people, and Africa was thought to be a promising pool of potential Jews. The Aguda received a number of informative communications about various Jewish communities, or various African communities rather, including the Igbo, including the Tutsi, and the Beta Israel, or Jews of Ethiopia, and decided that they could and should be brought into the Jewish fold. The Aguda members discovered to their surprise that beyond the confines of Africa even, the world was full of exotic peoples who were longing to be thought of as Jews. To them this must have come as a very, very considerable surprise. Because who in the 1940s, in the shadow of the greatest genocide that the world had seen, could have imagined that there were people who were actually volunteering to be Jewish? They were to be found in the Americas, in India, in Japan, the Pacific, and throughout Africa. In 1952, Ben Zev, the Arabist, wrote, "We think of making great efforts to bring millions of converts to Judaism, but we are pushing against an open door. Throughout Africa, quite apart from the Falashas, and throughout the world, there are millions of people who may well be Jews, who certainly aspire to be Jews, or who already think they are Jews. It's our duty to accept them and to spread our religion and our philosophy amongst them. In Africa, we shall find the good and faithful tribes who will take the place of the lost of the Shoah, should we turn them away." What I would like to do here, as briefly as possible, is describe the processes by which a couple of these good and faithful tribes, as Ben Ze'ev calls them, have evolved or been constructed as Jews or near Jews, and even more briefly, I shall try to assess their place in the Jewish world if they have one. The two communities which I propose to take as case studies are the Beta Israel, or the Ethiopian Jews, and the Lemba of southern Africa, both of whom have acted as proof communities, like proof texts, for other aspiring black Judaizing communities, and in the case of the Ethiopian Jews, for a very long time, because the first time that the Ethiopian Jews were used as a kind of proof community for others was before the First World War, as I believe Professor Trevisan was the first person to show. One question here is this: were the Beta Israel and the Lemba constructed out of European myths and racialist and colonialist fantasies in the process, as part of the process which I have already described, these fantasies of the other, in the same way as other African tribes, or are they authentic historical Jewish communities who may be viewed as descending from some ancient Israelite, Hebrew, or Jewish stock? A second question of much, much greater importance than this is, does it matter? Start with Ethiopia. As we've seen, for hundreds of years, Ethiopia was the locus par excellence of the Israelites in Africa myth, and in the even in the 19th century, efforts were still being made to locate the lost tribes of Israel in and around the mountainous areas of Ethiopia, as well as other parts of the world, including the Yemen, India, China, and so on. Prior to this, earlier on, the medieval world buzzed with strange rumours of the lost tribes and other strange Judaic peoples in the mountains of Ethiopia. As is well known, the arrival in Rome, San Stefano dei Abissini monastery at the end of the 15th century of some actual Ethiopians began to provide some quite reliable sounding information about the various populations of Ethiopia. A little bit later, Abraham Farisol, the great Sephardi polemicist and geographer, who spent most of his life in Ferrara, commented on accounts he'd heard from these black priests, and he wrote, they relate in detail the reality of many Jews living among them in Ethiopia. Further information about Israelites in Ethiopia was provided in the 17th century by the Portuguese Jesuit missionary Balthazar Teles, who wrote, there are still many of these Jews whom they call Falashas. They still have Hebrew Bibles and sing the Psalms very scurvily in their synagogues. Teles and Farisol both constructed the Beta Israel as Jews. Teles claimed they had no settled dwellings and suggested falsely that they owned Hebrew texts and also spoke Hebrew, but with much corruption in the words, as he stressed there is in their lives and manners. In reality, the Beta Israel community had no knowledge at all of Hebrew. There's no mention in any of the literature that they owned or held any Hebrew texts of any description. But of course, Jews elsewhere in the world had Hebrew text, as Teles knew, and knew Hebrew, and therefore, in order to construct their Jewishness, Teles made the Beta Israel Hebrew-speaking, Hebrew-singing, and provided them with Hebrew books. This is part of the general process of Western interference in terms of identity in Africa. For those travellers and missionaries who penetrated the kingdom, the construction of extraneous origins for some of Ethiopia's peoples was a way of accounting for certain unexpected phenomena, such as sophisticated buildings, complex social structures, or Israelite practices, as was the case elsewhere in Africa and the world along the lines of the Hermetic Hypothesis, which I already described. When the Scotch traveller James Bruce, who travelled in Ethiopia between 1769 and 1774, came across the Beta Israel, they explained that they came with Menelik from Jerusalem. So Bruce could note that they perfectly agree with the Abyssinians in the story of the Queen of Sheba, and that they had arrived at the time of King Solomon. As a result of Western influence, however, non-Beta Israel sources, after this time, began to suggest that the Beta Israel were not noble Israelites, but Johnny-come-lately Jewish Christ killers who'd come to Ethiopia after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. Their status as Jewish immigrants from Palestine, starting with Pharisol and Teles, became institutionalized when the Swiss Lutheran missionary Samuel Gobat urged the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews to take over the mission to the Beta Israel, which it did in 1859. There was not exactly a stampede on the part of Western Jews to go and greet their long-lost black brethren in Ethiopia. Filoseno Luzzatto, the erudite Italian Sephardi scholar, was one of the first to take an interest when he read about them in Bruce's travels when he was a young lad. Subsequently, he made contact with the Franco-Irish traveller and savant Antoine Dabadie, who travelled in Ethiopia between 1837 and 1848, whose replies to Luzzatto's probing questions made their way into the European Jewish press, including the Jewish Chronicle in London. Despite this, Western Jews only started to show anything other than a superficial interest in this so-called Jewish community in Ethiopia once it became known the Beta Israel were being targeted as Jews by the London Society. The Beta Israel community certainly didn't perceive themselves as Jews. They thought of themselves, if anything, as Israelites. In earlier periods, Ayhud, the Gez word for Jews, had been one of several derogatory designations for the Beta Israel by Christians, but the term was equally used to describe pagans or Christian heretics. It was never used by the Beta Israel themselves. Joseph Halevi, the Ottoman-born Jewish French Orientalist and traveller, most famous for his remarkable journeys in the Yemen, and the first Western Jew, to my knowledge, to contact the Beta Israel, did not realize this when in 1867 he went to Ethiopia as an emissary of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and at his first encounter with the Beta Israel he whispered in Amharic, "Are you Jews?" They looked a little embarrassed but didn't respond. Then he said, "Are you Israelites?" And as he wrote, a movement of assent mingled with astonishment proved to me that I'd struck the right chord. Jack Feitlovich did much to consolidate a construction of the Beta Israel as non-Ethiopian outsiders descended from a pre-Talmudic lost tribe of Israel which had found its way from ancient Israel to Ethiopia. This racial religious construction was accompanied by another racial construction which was completely at odds with the Beta Israel's account of themselves, the construction of the community as black. The colour terms in Ethiopia included white for foreigners, red, K, black, tekur, and light brown, teyem. The Beta Israel never considered themselves as the racially inferior tekur, but as K or teyem. If you were tekur, the chances are that you were a slave. Feitlovich described the Beta Israel both as Jews and black. They've kept the flag of Judaism flying in their country, he wrote, and can proudly proclaim, "We are black, but comely." Thus, from the 19th century, Beta Israel were constructed by outside European influence, not necessarily colonial in this particular case, as black Jews who had come to Ethiopia at some point in the past from the land of Israel. They're still widely accepted as black Jews of non-African origin, and their blackness and foreignness have underpinned most discussions of the Beta Israel to this day. Once the Beta Israel rejected the appellations Jew and black, but now in Israel, where they're universally known as Ethiopian Jews and often as black Jews, they've accepted them. Following the usual logic of the Hermetic Hypothesis, Jewish features were soon discerned among the Beta Israel. Henry Aaron Stern, a German Jewish convert to Christianity who worked as a missionary to the Beta Israel with the London Society, observed of them, there were some whose Jewish features no one could have mistaken who had ever seen the descendants of Abraham, either in London or Berlin. Their complexion is a shade paler than that of the Abyssinians, and their eyes, although black and sparkling, are not so disproportionately large as those which characteristically mark the other occupants of the land. In other words, not only did these people follow Jewish customs and the Jewish faith, they also looked like European Ashkenazi Jews. A member of the Beta Israel community who spent many years outside Ethiopia and who had internalized these constructions of Beta Israel appearance mentioned to a Western researcher that the community could recognize one another by their faces and particularly by their Jewish noses. Some foreign observers persuaded that the Beta Israel were Jews, thought that their skin color was temporary, and that once they moved to the more temperate climes of the land of Israel, it would revert to an appropriately Jewish off-white. Attempts to discover phenotypical features specific to the Beta Israel continue until modern times. In a hostile review of my book, Operation Moses, the president of the American Association for Ethiopian Jewry disputed my claim that the Beta Israel looked very much like other Ethiopians. He claimed that he'd observed that a different degree of blackness of skin characterizes the Falasha from other Ethiopian tribes. They're less African and more Mediterranean than the others. They have less frequency of African-associated chromosomes. The last three words are meaningless. In other words, the same kind of process has been at work among the Beta Israel as pertained during the same period among many other constructed Jewish communities from Africa to Australia. We now know that the origins of the Beta Israel do not lie either in the lost tribe of Dan, as claimed by the Israeli Sephardi chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, nor in the Jewish colony of Elephantini on the Nile, nor yet in wandering Karaites, as some have claimed, but rather in the evolution of a kind of Judaic-looking faith in Ethiopia, which grew out of Ethiopian Christianity. This scholarly deconstruction, carried out over the last 3 years, principally by Professor Steve Kaplan at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, James Quirin at Fisk, and Kay Shalimi at Harvard, and since about 1999, supported most unambiguously by geneticists, has produced a radically different perspective on Beta Israel history, which denies their direct link to any ancient Jewish groups, dates their emergence as a separate people to the last 500 years or so, and places their evolution firmly in the context of Ethiopian history and society. This body of work, which inevitably has been seen as politically incorrect in Israel, given that the Beta Israel are now citizens of the Jewish state, and as poorly educated newcomers have enough problems as it is, has shown that in fact there is no blood connection between the Beta Israel and Jews elsewhere. Yet a good deal of scholarly and publicistic writing continues to maintain, along the lines of the Hermetic Hypothesis, and despite a truly impressive lack of evidence, that the Beta Israel were blood relatives of mainstream Jews, that they were descended from Abraham, and that their origins therefore were from outside the African continent. What can be said, and I think that what can be said is always very much more important than what cannot be said, is that for half a millennium a kind of Israelitism was indeed practiced on Ethiopian soil by indigenous Africans, as it continues to be by other indigenous Africans. They suffered as a result of the practice of this religion, and when they were finally rescued by Israel as a good, faithful tribe from the stinking camps in the Sudan during the great Ethiopian famine of 1984, an event I had the privilege to witness, they were the first black people ever taken out of Africa, not in chains, as slaves. The historical experience of the Southern African Lemba tribe, my second group, has a great deal in common with that of the Beta Israel. Since the beginning of the 20th century, many Lemba have claimed to be of Israelite origin, and many Europeans have made a similar claim for them. They live, I should just say, in the northeast corner of South Africa and in different parts of Zimbabwe mainly, and there are small, less studied groups to be found also in Mozambique and probably southern Malawi. The Lemba have got an elaborate claim to have come from a city called Senna, which they placed across the sea somewhere in the north, and this is very similar to the Hermetic Hypothesis induced traditions which are found among very many African ethnic groups throughout Israel. Many of these groups will say, yes, we come from such and such a place, and they know rather specifically it's always in the north or the northeast. Much of the colonial travel and early ethnographic literature on the Lemba proposes an extraneous origin, an origin outside Africa. From the very first weeks of colonial intervention in the areas they inhabited, the Lemba tribe were identified as Jews and defined in precisely the same way as so many other people had been before and since, and for reasons embedded in the worldview of the Hermetic Hypothesis. Within months of the arrival of the white settlement in Mashonaland, an English colonist noted the similarity between Lemba customs and those of the Jews. These customs, he wrote, together with their lighter skin and their Jewish appearance, distinctly point to the ancient impress of Edomite Jews. Over the last few decades, as prevailing attitudes about race and Africa have changed, the construction of the Lemba as a Jewish and non-African community, particularly given their claim to have been associated with the building of the highly sophisticated monolithic building tradition of the great Zimbabwe civilization, one of the glories of Black Africa, which are situated more or less in the middle of present-day Zimbabwe, has taken on a politically incorrect character as well, much in the same way as the contrary presentation of the Beta Israel as an African people has taken on a politically incorrect colouring in Israel. In many respects, the modern identity of the Lemba seems to have been constructed by outsiders following the usual paradigm of the Hermetic Hypothesis. The Lemba are physically similar to their African neighbours in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and to me at any rate indistinguishable. Many of the tribe display a wide degree of colour variation, as do many other neighbouring peoples, but in general they're termed black, and their look, if one can generalise, is similar to that of other local groups. This didn't prevent the Western travellers who ventured into Lemba areas in the past, and who thought of the Jews as Jews or Semites, expressing the conviction, as others did, with respect to the Beta Israel, that the Lemba had phenotypical traits which confirmed their racial origins. An English writer in the 1890s spoke of the lighter skin and Jewish appearance of the Lemba. Another described the Lemba group, whose noses are straight and not flattened out at the base, like that of the true African. It was easy to believe that they were descended from some scattered remnant of the great Hebrew race. Karl Peters, the sadistic founder of German East Africa, and later a childhood hero of Adolf Hitler, writing of the Lemba in the 1890s, noted how absolutely Jewish is this type of people. He wrote, they've got faces cut exactly like those of ancient Jews who live around Aden. Also the way they wear their hair, their curls behind the ears, and the beard drawn out in single curls give them the appearance of Aden or of Polish Jews of the good old type. There's little possibility that Karl Peters really came across Lemba in the 19th century with Peus. Did he imagine it? Did the various aspects of Lemba life so perfectly conform with what he knew of Jews as to project upon his memory the one most obvious point of physical difference between Adeni Muslims and Jews, or between the Ostjuden of the time and Germans, the Seitkels? A. Jacques noted in 1931 that the whites of the northern Transvaal claimed to be able to distinguish a Lemba from his features and Jacques agreed that many Lemba have straight noses, rather fine features, and an intelligent expression which distinguishes them from the ordinary run of natives. One of my informants, he wrote, old Moshe even had what might be termed a typical Jewish nose, a rare occurrence in any real Bantu. Some of the early ethnographic work on the Lemba includes profile photographs of Lemba to establish that they did indeed have Jewish noses. Being awarded a Jewish nose and Jewish features had its disadvantages, as Howard Jacobson has pointed out in his wonderful novel Kaluki Nights. In the general European perception, and I quote, big nose bad, small nose good. So constructed with big Jewish noses, the Lemba were also deemed to have other Jewish qualities, some good, some bad. On the one hand, as possessors of a superior blood, Jewish was certainly better than black, a European look, and allegedly Caucasian features, they were regularly put in a higher and more favoured category than other tribes and were considered to be more trustworthy, more loyal, more hard-working, and more intelligent than others. But there was a downside. Whites in the area would often refer to the Lemba's money grubbing, on their sharp business skills, on their reluctance to spend unnecessarily, on their success, on the unusual number of Lemba who became university teachers, doctors and lawyers, viewed by them as Jewish professions. Some of these ideas were internalized by the Lemba themselves. In a South African compilation of so-called vernacular accounts, one Lemba wrote, the Lemba, in respect of their faces and noses, are well known to have been very handsome people. Their noses were exactly like those of Europeans. Plate 4 in this work again shows a profile of a Lemba with a prominent Jewish nose. The Lemba were constructed as Jews and were therefore expected to have a look which corresponded to a Jewish stereotype. In field work that was conducted by Dr. Egrove and myself about 10 years ago or so, we discovered amazingly that in one Zimbabwe village, the majority of Lemba respondents maintained that their Jewish nose was one of the most important things about them, one of the most important things indeed in their lives. No matter that outsiders usually commented on their paler skin, like the Beta Israel, they were always unequivocally tagged as black Jews. But this colour designation certainly sits uneasily with the Lemba's own view of themselves. If you ask a Lemba villager the question, who's black around here? They will point at some very, very distant Shona village and say something like, oh man, if you want to see a black man, you go to those villages of the Shona, they're really black. But as far as they themselves were concerned, they referred to themselves as the Varungo Vakabva Sena, the white men who came from Sena, and frequently make fulsome allusion to the remarkable and very attractive lightness of their own skin. My own engagement with the Lemba resulted in a book, the first edition of which connected the Lemba with the east coast of Africa. There were no written records which indicated to me anything about their ultimate origins beyond the eastern coast of the African continent. The trail, as far as I was able to determine it, stopped at the Indian Ocean. There was similarly not very much to suggest that they were of specifically Jewish origin, although there was a good deal to suggest that the religion they practiced prior to the colonization of their areas had much in common with the religion of the ancient Israelites. Indeed, their religion, insofar as it was possible to reconstruct it, was not entirely dissimilar to the religion of the Beta Israel prior to their Judaization in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was not dissimilar either to the various constructions of Israelite-type pre-colonial religions throughout Africa and other parts of the world. Many aspects of their tribal practice suggested an appreciation of the concept of separation of things, separation of animals, separation of people, which indeed may be taken as a fundamentally Jewish religious principle. They observed a number of seemingly Semitic practices. from endogamy to food taboos, a refusal to eat with other groups, a refusal to eat pork or animals which had not been ritually slaughtered, circumcision, which they may indeed have introduced into parts of southern Africa, menstrual seclusion, and so on. In 1996, a new and unexpected tool of research came into play, genetics, and here I refer back to the title of this workshop for the second time, because genetics was on the verge of becoming a new way, another new way of joining the Jewish people, and that again is going to be discussed in the course of the workshop. Essentially, the work that was done in genetics started towards the end of the 1990s, and it showed that there was indeed a connection between the Lemba and populations of South Arabia, and more specifically it showed that the priestly clan of the Lemba had a particular profile, a particular haplotype, which came to be known as the Cohen Modal haplotype, which has become world famous, and it was inferred from this Cohen Modal haplotype, which is found among Kohanim, Jews of priestly origin, to the extent of about 56% among Sephardi Jews and 45% or so in Ashkenazi Jews, and it has become, in many respects, something which until very recently, and I think perhaps the situation has slightly changed now, but until very recently it was seen as a way of identifying ancient Jewish communities. The genetic evidence now seems to suggest a precise connection not only between the Lemba and southern Arabia, which, given the close historic ties between the east coast of Africa and South Arabia, was not altogether surprising, but more specifically with ancient Jewish populations. Once again, the genetic findings seem to be entirely consistent, not only with the oral tradition of the Lemba, but also more problematically with the way in which the Lemba had been constructed by outsiders along the lines of the Hermetic Hypothesis. In the case of the Lemba, DNA had confirmed the construction, whereas in the case of the Beta Israel, they had deconstructed the construction. So this, in a way, the Lemba, in a sense, because in just about every other respect, the Lemba are just like all of the other communities throughout Africa, but in this particular case, they seem to be the exception qui confirme la règle, the exception which proves the rule, and there does indeed seem to be some basis for their construction as Jews. So as a result of what has been published in the media on different genetic studies, because by now there have been a lot, it's now widely believed that the Lemba may be of Jewish origin, and that so to proclaim has a scientific basis, even though no official Jewish religious or Israeli authority has yet determined that any specific DNA could affect the question of who is or who isn't a Jew. A number of groups and many individuals throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, have taken the genetic research on the Lemba as an indication that they are indeed Jewish and should be admitted as a matter of urgency into the family of Israel. The Lemba, as we've seen, are by no means the only group in Africa with such claims, but because of their genetic links, they tend to be given some priority as presumably Zera Israel, the seed of Israel. To many Jews, the DNA results appear to be a vindication of the efforts made by the Lemba to have themselves recognized as Jews, and they have entered the academic literature. I will just mention Nadia Abu al-Hajj of Barnard College, who did an interesting book called Rights of Return, and she says that the discussion of the Lemba case and the genetic results in the Lemba case She makes the point that these are now considered to be evidentiary grounds by many people, and it could well be that in the future such results may be included in Israel's criteria for immigration purposes, which may lead to general recognition of groups like the Lemba. As I only have a couple of minutes, I will spin forward. Now, some years ago, Professor Shai Cohen, who's now the Littauer Professor of Hebrew Literature and Philosophy at Harvard, said that the Lemba will be accepted as Jews, not as a result of their own practices or as a result of genetic markers, but if and when the Jewish people want them to become Jews. There now seems to be sufficient Jews who want them to become mainstream Jews for this to be considered a possibility. But in fact, the issue these days is not so much what Jews think, and as I've already said, in a way, I mean, we have Igbo Jewish communities and other African communities which are functioning in Africa, and they don't really need the permission of anybody to carry on functioning in the way that they are, and they don't really need anybody's permission to think of themselves as Jews if that's what they want to do. The key to acceptance by world Jewry, which is another issue, is the state of Israel. And in many respects, the dreams of the members of the Agudah Leman Nidchei Israel in the years immediately following the Holocaust have been largely realized. Israel's actual policy on immigration and on the status of such groups as the San Nicandro community, the Subotniki, the West Indian Bnei Israel, the Bnei Manasseh, in northeast India, the few Kaifeng Jews, the Karaites, or the Beta Israel, or the hundreds of thousands of Russians who are halakhically not Jewish, has been pretty pragmatic, and successors to the Agudah and the group around Ben Tzvi, such as the saintly Rabbi Avichail, architect of the so-called Elijah Project, or the brilliant Michael Freund, founder and chairman of Shavei Israel, or the indefatigable Bonita and Gerald Sussman, and many others in Kulanu, have ensured that this is likely to continue. Elsewhere in the world, Judaism is rapidly becoming more and more pluralistic. A number of Jewish organizations in the United States, Bechol Lashon, Kulanu are just two, are eager to encourage both converts and to reach out to the good faithful tribes. And in the US, this is part of a much wider phenomenon in the United States of people who practice a religion. This is an incredible statistic. Of people who practice a religion, over half today observe a religion into which they were not born, and increasingly people select Judaism or an aspect of Judaism as a religion which suits their temperament, philosophy, or lifestyle. No doubt these new freedoms of choice have acted as something of a spur to the return to Judaism of conversos in Mexico, Central and Southern America, and the Caribbean, which will be another of the topics of this workshop. A lot of other people choose Judaism. The synagogue in Miami, where I work, are full of converts from a multitude of backgrounds. They like its style, it suits them. And Judaism's adoption by so many people since the Second World War as a designer religion that meets lifestyle expectations is also a new way of joining the Jewish people. To conclude, then, 70 years after the end of the Holocaust, the Jewish people finds itself in a somewhat unexpected position, one which sets it apart from the groups like the Cambodians, Tutsi, or Armenians who have suffered analogous catastrophes. This unexpected position was one that was dimly perceived as a possibility by the group around Ben Tzvi and Feitlovich in the 1940s, but which today has grown into a global, transnational movement of Judaization, a movement towards joining the Jewish people. Some of these people may be of the seed of Israel, many more are clearly not. For most of them, the route to joining the Jewish people in an official way, which might also mean making aliyah, is through conversion. The challenge for Israel and for the Jewish people is to decide what to do about it. And I just have two practical things to say before I conclude. I'm a historian, and I believe in the importance of history. The processes which have led to the large number of people in the world today wishing to join the Jewish people are quite transparent, and they're quite clear. Therefore, whatever happens in Israel in terms of policy making should be based on the firm foundations of scientific work and not on the elaboration of myth. An example of this would be the many discussions on the issue of the Bnei Menashe. Now, the Bnei Menashe are a very interesting group. They came to a kind of Judaism through exactly the same process as a myriad groups throughout the world. This process has been described by Dr. Shalva Weil, who is with us today. It is being worked on by Dr. Shashua at the back, and I also have written a couple of articles on the subject. There is no secret about the process, and yet the discussion always seems to centre on fanciful and ahistorical suggestions that in some way this group has got something to do with the lost tribes of Israel, which really is a nonsense. My second point is that whatever the status in religious terms of some of these groups, for instance, Papua New Guinea, along with the Sussmans, I was with a Judaizing group in Papua New Guinea last year, a very interesting group. I've written a little bit about them. And you will never see as many Israeli flags as you will find in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. There is a fervent desire to be thought of as Zionists, a fervent desire to be thought of as Jews, and they're eager for instruction as they are for Jewish paraphernalia to celebrate rituals and so on and so forth. However, they are Christians as well as Jews, and this is something of an issue. I have another friend. I have a friend who was formerly a member of parliament in the Democratic Movement of Change in Zimbabwe, therefore a good guy. Mugabe has tried to kill him a few times. Luckily he hasn't succeeded. He is one of the most fervent of the Zimbabwe Judaizers, and he's constantly writing to me asking for more and more and more Jewish ritual objects and so on. He's very, very enthusiastic. He loves Israel, he loves the Jewish people, he thinks of himself as being Jewish, but he's an ex-pastor, and he was brought up as Christian. Every year he becomes less Christian, he becomes more Jewish, but still nobody wants to talk to him. The Jews, the Judaizing groups among the Lemba don't talk to him, and the Christians among the Lemba don't talk to him. So he's in a very lonely position, and one of the things that we have to do during this workshop is to decide what we do about people like him. And I think that my absolutely final point is this. There are lots of people in the world, I'm stopping. There are lots of people in the world who want to be Jews, who would like to come to Israel. And my own little piece of advice to the state of Israel, to Israelis, is this. There aren't all that many people in the world who actually love you. Go to France, go to England. You're not that popular. But these guys, they love you. And if you're going to make a choice between different kinds of Gastarbeiter, because this is a very advanced economy which needs cheapish labour, I personally would go for the Gogodala, or for the Igbo, or for the Lemba, or for many others, and it's always better to be served by friends. Thank you very much.
We're running late, so we'll only take 3 questions so we can get vaguely into this. Please.
Okay, Shulamit Halevi. I have a very strong comment, I'm afraid. You are trying to bring us many friends and you speak to us so kindly, not everybody hates us, but you're speaking like a racist. I am sorry to tell you, talking about Jewish noses, look at this nice gentleman, does he have a Jewish nose? No, off with his head. Does she have a Jewish nose? Off with her head. Does I have a Jewish nose? Off with my head. Look at this nice lady. Off with her head. She's not Jewish. What is this? Oh, a Birnbaum. He looks like Herzen. He gets his head on. Very big of a tree.
So what's your point?
What is this racism in your talk? And all this DNA business. We'll do DNA to all the Jewish people, and everybody who does the DNA, who hasn't got the DNA, will throw it out.
Could we have, please, attention?
This is racism.
Okay, got
I'm
it.
sorry.
Okay, next, I'm going to take the questions together. So are there anything else that anybody wants to ask?
Yeah.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Dr. Myers.
Yes, please, attention.
I was interested in the committee that you described, and interested also to learn more about what is the philosophy that you mentioned that they have. Also, the irony of the position that they were taking, if they were thinking of taking in people from racially different groups. Of course, the Jews from the Middle East themselves faced problems coming into Israel during the early years of the existence of the nation. In 1950-51, when most of the Jews from Iraq had chosen to abandon their citizenship, the Israeli authorities were restrictive in terms of the numbers of them who could leave at any time. And also, of course, there were problems with other Sephardic groups even coming to Australia, where Jews from Egypt and from other places were asked if they spoke Yiddish to prove their Jewishness. So what was the possibility of having people who were associated with the founding of Israel, who were going against what perhaps was Ashkenazi centric position?
Last point over here.
Just a question is that, with this whole idea of the reconstruction and the real origin and how these groups came to be, has anyone done similar research into the background of some of the known Jewish groups, particularly the Ashkenazi, and how that group came about and what their Jewish identity and so forth is based on?
Okay, so you have 3 questions: racism, the committee, and the origins of Ashkenazi Jews. 1 minute. 2.
Right, okay, the racism, maybe irony is not one of the things that you know about. Are you paying attention to me now? Please do so. Good. It was ironical. I was talking about stereotypes. According to the stereotype, if you'd paid attention, it would have been perfectly clear that I was...
Attention, every word.
Well, if that's the case, I give you 0. It was clearly about stereotypes. As far as genetics is concerned, read the literature and you will see that...
I'm in contact with DNA.
Very good.
Please.
Wonderful. That's all I have to say. And on the subject of your question, I don't have time. That's it.
All right, so we're going to now have a 10-minute break. That'll make us 5 minutes late into the next session. 10 minutes, everybody.